On the night of March 17th, 1978, the quiet border communities of southwestern New Brunswick and northeastern Maine were alive with celebration. It was St. Patrick's Day, a rare excuse for routine to be set aside, for music to echo through small town halls, and for people to cross the international border, not for work, but for something lighter. For one woman, that short trip across the St. Croix River would become the beginning of a mystery that has never been solved. Her name was Bonnie Joan Thomas. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just that she disappeared. It's where her story seems to end. Not in a dark alley, not on an isolated highway, but at one of the most controlled and visible places imaginable, an international border crossing. A place defined by structure, by observation, by records. And yet, somehow, Bonnie passed through that checkpoint and then vanished without a trace. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to begin with the final confirmed hours of her life. That evening, Bonnie made the short trip from New Brunswick into Calais, Maine. For residents in towns like St. Stephen, crossing into the United States was a normal part of life. The border wasn't a barrier, it was a routine. The American Legion Hall on Church Street was hosting a St. Patrick's Day dance, and it drew a crowd from both sides. Music, drinks, laughter. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. It was the kind of place where people let their guard down because they felt safe. Bonnie didn't arrive alone. She went with friends, blending into the crowd like anyone else there that night. There are no reports of arguments, no confirmed signs of distress, no clear indication that anything was wrong. In fact, that's part of what makes this case so difficult. There is no obvious turning point, no moment where everything shifts. But at some point during the night, something changed. When the event began to wind down and people started heading home, Bonnie made a decision that would define everything that followed. She left alone. She got into her vehicle, a red 1973 Volvo station wagon, and began the short drive back toward Canada. It was a familiar route, one she had likely driven many times before, a straight shot back towards St. Stephen, across the bridge, and through the customs checkpoint. A simple drive, one that should have taken only minutes, but she never made it home. In the early hours of March 18th, Bonnie arrived at the Canadian border crossing. What happened next stands out as one of the most puzzling details in the entire case. As she approached the checkpoint, she struck the customs booth with her vehicle. The collision itself was described as minor, but unusual enough to draw immediate attention from the officer on duty. That officer would become the last confirmed person to see Bonnie Joan Thomas alive. They spoke, a direct interaction, a moment that, in hindsight, feels incredibly important. But frustratingly, the details of that conversation have never been fully disclosed to the public. We don't know what was said, we don't know how Bonnie appeared, whether she seemed calm, shaken, distracted, or afraid. We don't even know if she was alone in the vehicle at that exact moment. All we know is this. After that brief exchange, she was allowed to continue. She crossed back into Canada. And then, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no phone calls, no trace of movement. Within minutes of leaving a monitored checkpoint, Bonnie Joan Thomas disappeared completely. That abrupt silence is what has haunted investigators for decades. Because logically, there should be something, a witness, a clue, a direction. But instead, the case seems to hit a wall the moment she drives away from that booth. And that raises a chilling question. What could happen in such a short stretch of time that leaves absolutely no trace behind? As the sun rose later that morning, no one yet knew that Bonnie was missing. There were no alarms, no immediate searches. Just an ordinary day beginning in a quiet part of New Brunswick. But beneath that calm surface, something had already gone terribly wrong. And before the day was over, the first real clue would emerge. One that would shift this case from a missing person to something far more troubling. Because Bonnie may have vanished, but her car did not. By the morning of March 18th, 1978, concern had begun to grow. Bonnie had not returned home. For a woman with a routine life, a steady job, and connections in a small community, that absence was immediately unusual. But it wasn't just her disappearance that raised alarm. It was what investigators found soon after. Her car. Later that same day, Bonnie's red 1973 Volvo station wagon was located in a place that made no sense for someone simply driving home. It had been abandoned on a logging road near St. Stephen, in a wooded area close to the St. Croix River. This was not a roadside breakdown, not a missed turn, not a temporary stop. Logging roads are isolated by nature, narrow, unmarked paths that cut deep into forested areas, typically used by workers, not by someone returning home from a night out. The location alone immediately raised questions. Why would Bonnie leave a main route and drive into such a secluded area, especially in the early hours of the morning? And more importantly, what happened once she got there? Investigators now had a physical scene to examine, but it came with frustrating limitations. The environment itself worked against them. Remote woodland terrain doesn't preserve evidence easily. Tracks can be obscured, disturbed, or disappear entirely within hours. And with the St. Croix River so close by, there was an added, chilling possibility that anything crucial could have been carried away or hidden beyond reach. There were also key details about the car that deepened the mystery. Bonnie's purse was not found inside the vehicle. That single missing item raised an entirely new set of questions. If she had left the car voluntarily, why take her purse into such a remote area in the middle of the night? If she had been forced out, was it taken with her or by someone else? And if this location was staged, was the absence of her belongings part of that staging? What's equally striking is what hasn't been publicly clarified. Critical details, like whether the keys were in the ignition, whether the doors were locked, or whether there were signs of a struggle, have never been fully disclosed. Those are the kinds of details that often shape an investigation, pointing toward either voluntary movement or sudden violence. In this case, the silence around those specifics only deepens the uncertainty. What investigators were left with was a contradiction. Bonnie had last been seen at a highly visible, controlled border crossing, alert enough to speak with a customs officer. And yet, within a short span of time, her vehicle appeared hidden away in a remote wooded area, completely detached from any logical route home. Somewhere between those 2 points, something had changed. The location of the car also introduced a geographic tension into the case. The St. Croix River, running alongside the area, serves as a natural boundary between Canada and the United States. That proximity raises difficult questions about movement, about jurisdiction, and about possibility. Could someone have crossed that same border unnoticed? Could Bonnie herself have ended up on either side? Or did everything happen within that quiet stretch of woods unseen and unheard? Search efforts in the area would have been limited by both time and terrain. Without a clear direction or witness account, investigators were left trying to reconstruct a sequence of events from a single silent object, the abandoned Volvo. And that object told them one thing with certainty. Bonnie Joan Thomas did not simply vanish without interruption. Her journey ended somewhere specific, somewhere physical, somewhere that investigators could stand, search, and question. But even standing there, they found no answers. Instead, the discovery of the car marked the moment this case shifted from a missing person to a likely act of foul play. Because cars don't abandon themselves and people don't just disappear from them without a trace. As investigators began to piece together what little they had, another development emerged. One that didn't come from the woods, or the river, or the border. It came from inside Bonnie's own home. And it would complicate the timeline in a way that still raises questions nearly half a century later. By the time Bonnie Joan Thomas's car was discovered, hidden along that remote logging road, investigators had already begun building a timeline. On the surface, it should have been straightforward. She attended a dance, left alone, crossed the border, and then vanished. But as soon as police began speaking with those closest to her, that timeline became far more complicated, because the official report of her disappearance didn't match the known facts. On March 18th, 1978, Bonnie's husband, Frank Thomas, contacted authorities to report her missing. At first, his account seemed routine, and he told police that Bonnie had left home earlier that day for work and never arrived. In many cases, that's how missing person investigations begin, with a missed shift, a break in routine, something small that signals something larger is wrong. But in this case, there was a critical problem. Bonnie didn't work during the day. She was employed at the Star-Kissed tuna plant in St. Andrews, and her schedule was consistent. She worked overnight shifts, beginning at 11 p.m. and ending at 7 a.m. That meant on the day she was reported missing, she was not scheduled to leave for work that morning. In fact, after attending the St. Patrick's Day dance the night before, she would have had the entire day off before her next shift. So why did her husband tell police she had gone to work that morning? This wasn't a minor discrepancy. It fundamentally altered the timeline of her disappearance. Instead of placing her last known movements during the late night hours after the dance and border crossing, his statement shifted the focus to the following morning, a period where there was no confirmed evidence of her being alive at all. For investigators, this created immediate confusion. Was this a simple mistake? Misunderstanding of her work schedule? It's possible. Stress and panic can distort memory, especially in the early hours of realizing someone is missing. But the inconsistency was significant enough to raise deeper questions. Because if it wasn't a mistake, then it was something else. A deliberate change in the narrative. Altering the timeline of a disappearance can have serious implications. It can redirect police resources, delay critical search efforts, and obscure the true sequence of events. In a case where timing is everything, where minutes and hours can determine whether evidence is found or lost, accuracy matters. And here, accuracy was already in question from the very beginning. What made this even more concerning was how it contrasted with the last confirmed sighting. A trained customs officer had interacted directly with Bonnie in the early hours of March 18th. That moment placed her alive at a very specific time and location. Yet the report from her own home suggested a completely different version of events, one that couldn't be reconciled with her known schedule. Two timelines. One supported by an official checkpoint, the other coming from the person closest to her. They didn't match, and that disconnect would linger over the entire investigation. As police continued their work, they were now dealing with more than just a disappearance. They were dealing with conflicting accounts, uncertain timing, and a growing sense that something important was being missed or possibly hidden. Because when a timeline breaks down in a case like this, it doesn't just create confusion, it creates doubt. Doubt about what really happened, doubt about who might know more than they're saying, and doubt about whether the truth is being told at all. As the investigators looked deeper into Bonnie's life, that doubt didn't fade. Instead, it led them toward a deeply troubling reality, one that had been hidden behind the walls of her home, and one that would change how this entire case was understood. Because the timeline wasn't the only thing that didn't fit. Neither did the life she was living. As investigators struggled to make sense of the timeline, another layer of the case began to surface, one that shifted the focus away from roads, borders, and wooded areas, and into something far more personal. Bonnie Joan Thomas's home life. Up to this point, the case had been defined by unanswered questions and missing pieces. But as police and those close to Bonnie began speaking more openly, a troubling pattern emerged, one that could not be ignored. Reports indicated that Bonnie's marriage was not a peaceful one. According to multiple accounts that have surfaced over the years, her relationship with her husband, Frank Thomas, was marked by ongoing domestic violence. These were not isolated incidents or minor disputes. The reports described repeated physical abuse, serious enough that Bonnie had, at times, required medical attention. This wasn't speculation born decades later. Allegations of violence were part of the broader understanding of her life, known within certain circles, even at the time. And that changes everything, because when a person disappears under suspicious circumstances, investigators look first at those closest to them, not out of assumption, but because statistically, those relationships often hold the answers. In Bonnie's case, the existence of a documented pattern of abuse immediately introduced a potential motive. It painted a picture of a woman living under pressure, a woman navigating not just the routines of work and daily life, but the unpredictability of violence behind closed doors. And that raises difficult, unavoidable questions. What happened when she returned home that night, if she made it home at all? Was there an argument? Had something been building beneath the surface long before March 17th? Did her decision to go out that night, to cross the border and spend time away, create tension when she came back? Or did she never get the chance to return at all? The presence of domestic violence doesn't provide answers on its own, but it does shift the lens through which the case is viewed. It introduces the possibility that Bonnie's disappearance was not random, that it may not have involved a stranger, or a chance encounter, or a moment of bad luck. It suggests something more contained, more personal, more deliberate. And when that possibility is placed alongside the earlier inconsistency in her husband's statement, the timeline that didn't align with her actual work schedule, the concern deepens. Because now, it's not just about what might have happened. It's about what might have been concealed. Still, despite these concerns, it's critical to be clear. No charges have ever been laid against Frank Thomas in connection with Bonnie's disappearance. He has never been officially named as a suspect by law enforcement. That distinction matters, but so does the context, because investigations are built on evidence, not assumptions. And in this case, evidence was exactly what investigators were missing. No witnesses placing Bonnie after the border crossing. No confirmed signs of a struggle. No forensic link tying any individual to her disappearance. Only circumstances. And circumstances, no matter how troubling, are not enough to close a case. What they do, instead, is leave investigators and the public caught between two possibilities. One, that the answer lies within Bonnie's personal life, hidden behind silence and time. The other, that something happened outside of it entirely, involving someone who has never been identified. Either way, the result is the same. No resolution, no accountability, and no clear direction forward. As the days following Bonnie's disappearance turned into weeks, and then into months, the investigation began to slow. Leads dried up. The trail, already thin, began to disappear completely. What remained was a case built on fragments, each one important, but none of them enough. And with every passing year, the distance between what happened and what could be proven only grew wider. Because in the absence of answers, time doesn't heal a case like this. It buries it. By the time the investigation into Bonnie Joan Thomas's disappearance began to slow, the case had already settled into something deeply unsettling. Not because of what was known, but because of what wasn't. There was no confirmed crime scene, no witnesses beyond the border crossing, no physical evidence tying any one person to her disappearance, and most significantly, no trace of Bonnie herself. Despite the early urgency, the search efforts around the area where her car was found did not produce answers. The wooded terrain near the St. Croix River remained quiet, offering no indication of what had taken place there in the early hours of March 18th, 1978. If something had happened in that location, it left behind nothing that investigators could use to move the case forward. Without a body, the case could not evolve into a homicide investigation in the traditional sense. And yet, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, her abandoned vehicle, the unexplained detour off a direct route home, and the absence of any contact led authorities to treat it as a case involving foul play. That classification speaks volumes. It reflects a conclusion drawn not from a single piece of evidence, but from the totality of the situation. People do not simply vanish under those conditions, not without leaving something behind. But in Bonnie's case, that something was never found. As the years passed, the investigation transitioned from active pursuit to long-term uncertainty. Files remained open, but leads became scarce. The kind of breakthrough that cases like this depend on, a witness coming forward, a discovery in the environment, a confession, never materialized. And so, the case became part of a larger category that no family ever wants to face, unresolved but not forgotten. For those who knew Bonnie, the absence of answers created a different kind of weight. Without confirmation, there is no closure, no definitive understanding of what happened, no place to direct grief, no final chapter to hold on to, just the constant presence of a question that has never been answered. What makes this case especially haunting is how narrow the window is. Bonnie was last seen at a controlled checkpoint, speaking directly with a customs officer. Her car was found not far from that location, hidden away in a place that suggests intention. The distance between those 2 points is small, geographically and in time. And yet within that small space, everything disappears. No one has ever come forward to say they saw her after she left the border. No one has provided information that definitively explains why her car ended up where it did. No new evidence has emerged that changes the direction of the case. It is, in every sense, a silence that has held for decades. But silence does not mean the case is closed. The disappearance of Bonnie Joan Thomas remains an open investigation, and like many cases of its kind, it exists in the hope that time, rather than erasing the truth, might eventually reveal it. That someone, somewhere, knows something, whether it's a detail that once seemed insignificant, or a memory that has been held back for too long. Cases like this are not solved by time alone. They are solved when something changes, a new perspective, a new piece of information, a willingness to speak. Until then, Bonnie's story remains suspended in uncertainty, a life interrupted, a path that ends without explanation, and a question that continues to echo through New Brunswick nearly half a century later. What happened after she crossed that border? Why was her car left on that logging road? And who, if anyone, knows the truth? If you have any information about the disappearance of Bonnie Joan Thomas, no matter how small it may seem, you are encouraged to contact the New Brunswick RCMP or Crime Stoppers. Even after all these years, answers are still possible. Because unresolved does not mean unsolvable, and forgotten is the one thing this case should never become. In the city of St. John, New Brunswick, William Pop Puddington was more than just a taxi driver. By the autumn of 1949, he was a local fixture. At 72 years old, he had spent decades behind the wheel, quietly working the late shifts and learning every street, hill, and shortcut in the city. Other drivers knew him well, and so did regular passengers. He was dependable, calm, and trusted, the kind of man people specifically asked for when they wanted to feel safe getting home at night. William worked for Diamond Taxi, one of the city's busiest cab companies at the time. Even at his age, he continued driving evenings, something that was not unusual for him. He was known for being punctual and polite, and he rarely turned down a fare. His family later said that driving was simply part of who he was. It kept him active, connected to the city, and useful in a world still recovering from the Second World War. On the night of Thursday, October 6th, 1949, St. John was wrapped in thick coastal fog. The air was cold and damp, rolling in from the Bay of Fundy and settling over the streets. Visibility was poor, and sounds carried strangely through the mist. It was the kind of night where familiar places felt unsettling, and quiet roads felt even more isolated. Sometime after 11 o'clock that night, a call came into the Diamond taxi office. The caller asked for a cab to pick up two men on Beaverbrook Avenue, an area in the north end of the city. What stood out immediately was the request that followed. The caller did not ask for just any driver. He specifically asked for Pop. Requests for certain drivers were not unheard of, especially for someone as well known as William Puddington. Still, the request was noted. William accepted the call without hesitation. He was seen leaving to collect the fare, unaware that this routine trip would be his last. He drove off into the fog, heading toward Beaverbrook Avenue. Just another shift. Just another ride. No one knew it at the time, but this call would become one of the most chilling details in one of Canada's longest-standing unsolved murder cases. The decision to ask for William by name would later haunt investigators and raise questions that still have no clear answers. As the night moved closer to midnight, something began to feel wrong. William Puddington had not checked in, and he had not returned for another fare. For a driver who was known to be reliable, the silence stood out. Other Diamond taxi drivers continued working through the fog, unaware that one of their own had vanished somewhere in the north end of the city. Shortly before midnight, one of those drivers came across something alarming on the Somerset Road extension. A Diamond taxi cab was sitting in the roadway, positioned in a way that made no sense. The engine was off. The doors were closed. Most troubling of all, the cab was empty. Police were contacted right away, and officers arrived to inspect the vehicle. Inside the cab, there were no obvious signs of a struggle. However, one personal item immediately caught their attention. William Puddington's hat was resting on the back seat. To those who knew him, this detail was unsettling. He was rarely seen without it. There was no sign of the driver himself, and no clear explanation for why the cab had been abandoned where it was. News spread quickly among the taxi drivers. William's son, Edwin Puddington, who also worked as a cab driver, became increasingly worried. Based on experience and knowledge of the area, he began to think about routes his father might have taken after picking up the fare. One road in particular stood out in his mind. Edwin drove toward Boar's Head Road, a narrow and lightly traveled stretch bordered by thick brush and uneven ground. Visibility was still poor, and the fog clung tightly to the area. As he moved slowly along the road, his headlights swept across the ditch beside it. That was when he saw something no son should ever have to find. William Puddington's body was lying near the edge of the road. Police were called immediately, and the area was secured. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of his family and co-workers. What had begun as a missing driver case was now something far darker. By the early hours of the morning, it was clear that this was not an accident. William Puddington had been the victim of a violent attack, and whoever was responsible had vanished into the night. The fog that had filled the streets hours earlier now seemed to hang over the investigation itself, hiding answers just out of reach. By morning, the quiet stretch of Boar's Head Road had become the center of a major police investigation. Officers from the St. John Police Department were joined by members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The area was carefully searched, with attention given to the roadway, the ditch, and the surrounding brush where William Puddington had been found. Investigators quickly determined that William had been attacked after leaving the city streets. The location suggested the cab had been deliberately driven to a secluded area, away from homes and traffic. Nearby, police recovered a heavy metal bumper, Jack believed to have come from William's taxi. It was found discarded a short distance from where his body lay, indicating it had been used during the attack and then thrown aside. Other details added to the sense that this crime was planned. William's personal belongings were missing. His keys were gone, and the cash he had been carrying from his shift was no longer on him. At the time, investigators believed he had roughly $26 with him, a typical amount for a night of fares. The disappearance of that money pointed toward robbery as a possible motive, though it did not explain the extreme level of violence involved. Police worked to reconstruct the timeline leading up to the murder. The taxi request was traced back to a public telephone near Beaverbrook Avenue. Witnesses reported seeing two men in the area. Around the time the call was believed to have been made, one man was seen using the phone while the other waited nearby. Unfortunately, the fog and darkness made it impossible to get clear descriptions, leaving investigators with little more than vague impressions. One of the most puzzling details was where William's taxi was eventually found. The cab had been left not far from the area where the phone call was placed, rather than near the site where William was killed. This suggested that the attackers returned to the neighborhood after the murder, calmly abandoning the vehicle before disappearing on foot. It was a move that showed confidence and familiarity with the area. Despite extensive searches and questioning, no usable physical evidence emerged. In 1949, forensic tools were limited. There were no surveillance cameras, no reliable way to collect trace evidence, and no national databases to cross-reference suspects. Every promising detail seemed to dissolve under closer examination. As days passed with no arrests, the investigation began to stall. The evidence painted a disturbing picture, but it did not point to anyone specific. Whoever killed William Puddington had taken advantage of the night, the fog, and the limitations of the era, leaving behind a crime scene full of questions and no clear answers. As the investigation dragged on, police and the public began to speculate about why William Puddington was killed. One of the simplest explanations was robbery. The missing $26, his keys, and the absence of other personal items suggested that the attackers may have planned to steal from him. In post-war St. John, even a small sum could tempt desperate individuals, but many found it hard to accept that someone would attack a 72-year-old man with such force for so little money. Another possibility was that the murder was more personal. The fact that the men specifically asked for pop hinted at familiarity. Perhaps they knew William by reputation or had crossed paths with him before. Over his decades driving in St. John, he likely met many people under ordinary circumstances, some of whom may have harbored grudges or anger. The targeted nature of the ride and the remote location where the crime occurred suggested planning, not random opportunity. Some investigators also considered the attackers' boldness. The taxi was abandoned just a short distance from the phone where the call had been made. This indicated they returned to the area after committing the crime, leaving the vehicle in plain sight, as if daring anyone to follow. The careful choice of Boar's Head Road, isolated yet accessible, also spoke to someone familiar with the city's layout and capable of exploiting its quiet corners. Over time, the lack of witnesses or clear descriptions allowed the mystery to deepen. Despite questioning hundreds of people and following numerous leads, police could not identify anyone matching the men seen near the payphone. The case became a troubling example of how a violent crime could vanish in the fog of a city, leaving no one to hold accountable. By the early 1950s, the trail had gone cold. William's family struggled with unanswered questions, and the city of St. John was left with a sense of unease. Drivers like William were suddenly reminded that even routine fares carried risk, and the shadow of the unsolved case hung over the community for decades. Theories continued, but none ever led to a suspect, and the true motive behind the murder remained an open question, echoing silently along the empty roads where William's last ride began. Decades have passed since that foggy night in October 1949, yet the murder of William "Pop" Puddington remains one of New Brunswick's most haunting unsolved cases. Despite modern investigative methods and advances in forensic science, no one has ever been charged. And the identities of the two men who requested his cab continue to elude authorities. Over the years, the case has become part of local history, discussed in newspapers, true crime circles, and the memories of those who lived through the time. Each retelling emphasizes the chilling detail that the killers specifically asked for William by name, a reminder that sometimes crime is not random, and some targets are chosen with intent. The location, Boar's Head Road, remains a quiet and remote stretch of St. John, but for those who know the story, it carries the weight of a tragedy that never found closure. For the Puddington family, the loss has never faded. William's son Edwin and other relatives have carried the pain of knowing exactly how and where he died, but never why or at whose hands. Their grief is compounded by the lack of justice, a reminder that some crimes leave behind questions that even time cannot answer. The murder also serves as a cautionary tale for the city's taxi drivers and residents of St. John. It is a story of vulnerability, even in familiar surroundings, and of how a seemingly ordinary night can turn into a nightmare. It underscores how small details, the fog, the deserted road, a specific request, can all become pieces of a puzzle that may never be solved. William Puddington's story endures not just as a cold case file, but as a testament to the shadows that linger in everyday life. The city has changed, technology has improved, and yet the questions remain. Who were the two men in his cab, and why did they target him? Until someone can answer, the mystery of William Pop Puddington continues to echo through St. John, a haunting reminder that some crimes leave nothing but the silence of the night and the unanswered whispers of history. On the evening of December 27th, 2021, the cold air settled over Fredericton, New Brunswick, like any other winter night. Streets were quiet, lights glowed softly through frosted windows, and for most people, it was just another day between Christmas and the New Year. But for one family, this night would become the beginning of a nightmare that still hasn't ended. That night, a 38-year-old woman named Erin Brooks stepped into a small, familiar place in her community. It was the St. Mary's Smoke Shop, located on Cliff Street, right in the heart of St. Mary's First Nation. Inside, everything seemed normal. A routine stop, a quick visit, nothing unusual. But what happened next would leave behind only fragments. Security cameras captured her presence inside the shop, just a brief moment frozen in time. Erin is seen wearing blue jeans, a dark jacket, and black boots. Her hair, dark with bangs, frames her face. It's an ordinary image. The kind you wouldn't look twice at, unless you knew it would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Because after she left that store, Erin Brooks got into a vehicle, and then she vanished. No confirmed sightings, no phone activity, no contact with family, just silence. To understand why this disappearance hit so deeply, and why it still echoes years later, you have to understand who Erin Brooks was before she became a missing person. Erin was born and raised in Fredericton, deeply connected to the Sitansis community, also known as St. Mary's First Nation. This wasn't just where she lived. It was home in every sense of the word. Family, culture, identity, all rooted in that place. She was a mother of 4 children, and by all accounts, they were the center of her world. The people who knew Erin describe her as someone full of life, someone who could light up a room with her presence. She had a strong personality, a warmth to her, and a sense of humor that made people feel comfortable around her. She wasn't invisible. She mattered deeply to the people in her life. Physically, she was petite, about 5'2", around 115 pounds. But what stands out more than her appearance is the way her family talks about her. There's love there, but also a kind of pain that only comes from not knowing, because Erin's life, like many, wasn't without its challenges. Her family has spoken openly about her struggles with addiction, not to define her, but to be honest about her life. They've made it clear that this was just one part of who she was, not the whole story. She was still a mother, still a daughter, still someone deeply loved. And there's something else, something that makes this case even more haunting. Years before she disappeared, Erin made a post online, a message that, in hindsight, feels almost impossible to ignore. In that post, she wrote that if she ever didn't come home, people should not assume she left on her own. She made it clear, if something happened to her, it wouldn't be by choice. She was asking people to look for her, to not make excuses, to take it seriously. At the time, it may have just seemed like a reflection of fear, but now, those words feel like a warning, a chilling piece of foresight that no one could have imagined would become real. Because just 3 years later, everything she feared happened. By the time her family realized something was wrong, Erin had already been gone long enough for concern to turn into panic. Days passed without contact, and for someone so connected to her family, especially her children, that silence was not normal. Something was off. Something wasn't right, and deep down, they knew it. What makes this case especially unsettling isn't just the disappearance itself. It's how ordinary it all began. A quick stop at a local shop, a short ride in a vehicle, familiar place, a familiar routine. There were no signs of struggle, no immediate red flags, just a quiet exit into the night. And yet, that ordinary moment became the dividing line between what was known and what remains a complete mystery. As the hours turned into days, and days into weeks, one question started to take hold, not just for her family, but for the entire community. What happened in those moments after she left that store? Who was in that vehicle, and where did they go? Because whatever happened next is where the truth is hiding, and in this case, the truth has remained just out of reach. Next, we're going to break down that critical timeline in detail. What investigators know about Erin's final movements, what they haven't released, and why those missing minutes after she left the smoke shop may hold the key to everything. The most important part of any disappearance isn't always what happens over days or weeks. Sometimes, everything comes down to just a few minutes. And in the case of Erin Brooks, those missing minutes, right after she walked out of that smoke shop, may be the key to everything. Let's break this down carefully. We know that on the evening of December 27th, 2021, Erin was seen inside the St. Mary's smoke shop on the north side of Fredericton. That moment is confirmed. It's backed by surveillance footage. It's the last solid point in the timeline, something investigators can anchor to. But once she steps outside, the certainty disappears. Police have confirmed one crucial detail. After leaving the store, Erin got into a vehicle. That single fact changes everything, because it means she didn't just walk off into the night. She didn't vanish on foot. She left in a car with someone, and that raises immediate questions. Was the vehicle already waiting for her? Or did it arrive after she stepped outside? Did she recognize the person inside? Or was this a spontaneous decision? A quick ride, a short trip, something that felt harmless in the moment? Investigators have never publicly released a description of that vehicle. No make, no model, no color, and more importantly, no identity of the driver. That silence isn't accidental. In cases like this, police often hold back key details to protect the investigation. If someone comes forward with information, they want to be able to verify it, without that person simply repeating details they heard publicly. But at the same time, that lack of information creates a kind of void, because everything that happened next is hidden inside that unknown vehicle. And that's where the timeline becomes unsettling. There are no confirmed sightings of Erin after that moment. No witnesses placing her anywhere else that night. No surveillance footage showing where the vehicle went. No phone activity that's been publicly shared. It's as if the trail just stops. And when a timeline ends that abruptly, it usually means one of two things. Either something happened very quickly, or whatever happened was carefully hidden. Now here's where things get even more important. The last time Erin's family saw her was actually 2 days earlier, on Christmas Day. That means there's already a gap between her last family contact and the final confirmed sighting at the smoke shop. So investigators aren't just trying to piece together one moment. They're trying to understand a wider window of time. Who was she with in those days? Where was she staying? Who did she talk to? Those answers could be just as important as what happened after she got into that vehicle. But the reality is, from a public perspective, the timeline becomes extremely narrow at the very end. Everything funnels into a single point. A woman walks out of a store, gets into a vehicle, and disappears. And then, just over a month later, on February 3rd, 2022, investigators made a major announcement. They said they believed Erin Brooks was likely the victim of foul play. That statement doesn't come lightly. Police don't move in that direction without reason. It suggests that behind the scenes, there is information, evidence, or intelligence that points away from a voluntary disappearance. Something happened to Erin, and whatever it was, it likely happened not long after she got into that vehicle, because there are no signs she made it anywhere else, no trace of her reaching a second location, no indication she continued on with her night. That car ride may have been the last stretch of her life that anyone could have followed, which is why investigators have focused so heavily on one idea. Someone out there knows what happened in those moments. Someone saw that vehicle, someone knows who was driving it, and someone knows where it went. Because cases like this don't just disappear into thin air, they disappear into silence. And that silence, especially in a close-knit community, is often the hardest thing to break. By the time the calendar turned into February of 2022, the tone of Erin Brooks' case had already changed. What began as a missing person investigation had quietly shifted into something far more serious. On February 3rd, 2022, the Fredericton police force made it official. They announced that Erin's disappearance was now considered suspicious, and that investigators believed she was likely the victim of foul play. That single update confirmed what her family had feared from the very beginning. This was not a situation where she had simply walked away. Behind the scenes, the case file had already taken a different direction. From that point forward, every step investigators took would be guided by one assumption: that a crime had occurred. As the months passed, that position only became stronger. Police would later go even further, confirming that Erin's disappearance is being investigated as a homicide. It's a powerful statement, especially in a case where there is still no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no publicly named suspect. So how do investigators reach that conclusion? In cases like this, it usually means they have access to information that hasn't been released to the public. That could include witness statements, digital evidence, or patterns in Erin's movements that suggest something went wrong. While none of those details have been shared openly, the certainty in their language tells us something important. They are not guessing. They believe they know what happened. But proving it is something entirely different. From the outside, the investigation can feel quiet, almost too quiet. No major updates, no dramatic breakthroughs, no arrests. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. In fact, police have repeatedly stated that the case remains active. Every tip that comes in is followed up on. Every lead is examined. Investigators continue to work behind the scenes, revisiting details, re-interviewing individuals, and looking for anything that might have been missed. Still, there's a clear frustration that comes through in their public statements. Because despite years of work, the case has not moved forward in a way the public can see. One of the most telling aspects of this investigation is how much information has been withheld. The identity of the driver of that vehicle Erin got into has never been released. No description of the car has been made public. No timeline beyond her last sighting has been confirmed. That level of secrecy is intentional. Police have explained that holding back certain details helps protect the integrity of the investigation. If too much information is made public, it can contaminate witness statements or give a potential suspect insight into what investigators know. It also allows police to test the credibility of tips. If someone comes forward with information that matches details only investigators would know, it adds weight to their statement. But there's another side to that strategy. It means the public is left with very little to go on. And in a case like this, where community awareness could be crucial, that silence can feel like a barrier. Investigators have made it clear that they believe the answers are not far away. In fact, they've said something that stands out. They believe there are people within the Fredericton area who know exactly what happened to Erin Brooks. That's not speculation, that's a direct message. Someone saw something, someone heard something, someone knows more than they've said. And yet, for years, that information hasn't come forward. To try and break that silence, a reward was introduced. What started as a community-driven effort eventually grew, with an anonymous donor significantly increasing the amount. The total reward now stands at $65,000 for information that leads to locating Erin. It's a substantial amount designed to encourage anyone, to step forward. Because in cases like this, it often comes down to one person making a decision, to speak or to stay silent. The investigation has also reached beyond New Brunswick. Erin's story has been featured in national and international media, including documentary series focused on missing persons cases. The goal is simple: expand the reach, bring new eyes to the case, spark a memory in someone who may not have realized what they knew was important. Sometimes all it takes is one small detail, something overlooked, something dismissed at the time, to change everything. But as of now, that detail hasn't surfaced. And that leaves investigators in a difficult position. They believe a crime has been committed. They believe people have information. But they do not yet have the evidence needed to lay charges. It's a gap that exists in many cases like this. Belief without proof, suspicion without confirmation, a theory without the one piece that ties it all together. And without that piece, the case remains suspended, active but unresolved. As we wrap up, we'll look at the impact this case has had beyond the investigation itself. The toll on Erin's family, the response from her community, and how her disappearance connects to a much larger and deeply troubling reality across Canada. For investigators, the case of Erin Brooks is still open. But for her family, time didn't just move forward, it stopped. Not on the day police made their announcement, not when media coverage spread across the country. It stopped on December 27th, 2021, the last day Erin was seen. Since then, everything has existed in a kind of painful pause. Because when someone disappears without answers, there is no clear ending, no moment of closure, no place to grieve, just an ongoing question that never seems to fade. For Erin's family, that question is constant. Where is she? Her mother has spoken openly about what this kind of loss feels like. It's not just grief, it's uncertainty layered on top of it. The kind of pain that doesn't settle because there's nothing solid to hold on to. Without knowing where Erin is, there's no way to bring her home, no way to lay her to rest, no way to truly begin healing. And for her children, that absence is something they carry every single day. They are growing up without their mother, without answers, and without the chance to understand what really happened. What remains instead is a space in their lives that couldn't be filled, only questioned. But this loss didn't stop with her immediate family. It spread through her entire community. In St. Mary's First Nation, Erin's disappearance became something larger than a single case. It became a shared grief, a shared fear, and a shared determination to keep her name alive. Vigils have been held, candles lit in the cold, people gathering not just to remember Erin, but to demand answers, to show that she is not forgotten. One of the most powerful symbols to appear in response to her disappearance has been the red dress, hung in trees, displayed in public spaces. These empty red dresses represent Indigenous women who are missing or have been taken. They stand as a visual reminder of lives interrupted, voices silenced, and families left behind. After Erin vanished, those red dresses became part of her story too, because her case is not isolated. It exists within a much larger reality in Canada. one that has affected Indigenous communities for generations. Indigenous women face disproportionately high rates of violence and disappearance. It's a crisis that has been acknowledged at a national level, but one that continues to unfold in real time. Erin Brooks is now part of that reality, and that's something her family has had to come to terms with in the most painful way possible. Her disappearance is not just about one night. It's not just about one unknown vehicle. It's about a system where cases like this happen far too often and remain unsolved far too long. Even now, years later, the investigation remains active. Police continue to follow leads. They continue to ask for information, and they continue to emphasize one critical point. The answers are still out there. Someone knows what happened after Erin left that smoke shop. Someone knows who she got into that vehicle with, and someone knows where she is. The reward for information still stands at $65,000. But more important than the reward is what it represents. A chance to finally bring Erin home. A chance to give her family the answers they've been waiting for. A chance to break the silence that has surrounded this case from the very beginning. Because silence is what allows cases like this to remain unsolved. And breaking that silence is the only way forward. As we reach the end of this story, one thing becomes clear. This is not just a mystery. It's a life that was interrupted. A family that has been left in limbo. And a community still searching for the truth. If you know anything, no matter how small it may seem, now is the time to come forward. You can contact the Fredericton Police Force directly, or if you wish to remain anonymous, you can reach out to Crime Stoppers. That one piece of information, something that might not seem important, could be the missing piece investigators have been searching for. Because after all these years, the question hasn't changed. What happened to Erin Brooks? And somewhere, someone still holds the answer.